Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here to listen to my talk today. I had quite a lot of choice in deciding what I would talk about today, and I understand that probably none of you or very few of you are native English language speakers, so I will try to talk today not too fast, even though when I get nervous, I sometimes talk very fast, so I will try to keep it calm for you today. So today's talk is Beyond the Media, Understanding the Race for the Arctic. Now, I'm a researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. I'm also affiliated here with UE with the Russia program. And another logo on my slide is that I'm a researcher affiliated with the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge. And I have been researching for around the last 12 years on the Arctic region, and I'm very excited about the Arctic, especially icebergs, but I'm not going to talk to you about icebergs today. So to give you a little bit of context about today's talk, I'm a social scientist, and my research is situated at the intersection between geography and international relations theory. So you will see quite a large number of maps today in our presentation. So I hope everyone loves maps. So in my research over the last few years, I've been researching on the geography, the history, and the governance of the Arctic. And I've been researching on this area so I can better understand why it is states do what they do in the Arctic and why it is they say what they say in the Arctic. So today we're going to talk about understanding what is happening in the Arctic beyond what the media is writing when they're talking about the race for the Arctic. So all of you are students who are interested in international affairs. I'm assuming that's why you're here today. And as you read newspapers and watch news reports, the Arctic probably comes up on a fairly regular basis. So I thought it might be useful if I was to explain some of what's happening behind the news. Many of the themes that you see coming up in the news of the Arctic on a regular basis are a couple of key topics. One of these topics is the melting ice. Another topic is shipping routes. And the other topic is oil and gas. These three are almost always mentioned in all of the articles on the Arctic. And a lot of them also talk about some sort of race or scramble, contest, or battle. And all of these points are important, but they're important relative to a much bigger story about the Arctic. And this more important story is a story about changing rules for sovereignty over the different types of territory across the whole world, not just in the Arctic. So recently, one of my colleagues came into my office with a newspaper, and it has one of these Race for the Arctic headlines. This will be a newspaper that's probably familiar to you, Svenska Dagbladet. And the headline, I'm going to try and say this in Swedish for you, so I apologize in advance. Stormakterna skyndar på kapplöpningen till Arktis. The race for the Arctic is speeding up. And there's this image of the Arctic on the front of this newspaper. It's an ice field with a bright red flag in it. You can see a man walking away from the flag and he's carrying something big and heavy. And when I first look at it, it looks like a weapon. It looks like it's probably a gun. But if I look closer with my aging eyes, I'm like, oh no, that's not a gun, that's a drill. But my first instinct was, this is a security issue. And there's no caption, there's no picture, there's no message telling me what this picture is about, only the headline. But before we get too far into this exciting world of Arctic news, I want to talk to you a little bit about the geography of the Arctic. So, where is the Arctic? It's in the north. It's on the northern side of the planet that we call Earth. But looking at this map with a Mercator projection, we can just see that the Arctic is a little tiny white strip at the top of the Arctic. It doesn't have an easily recognizable shape like, say, the continent of Australia or Italy, which is a nice shape of a boot and easy to find. So how would you know if you were in the Arctic? This newspaper article gives us some clues. It has 3 definitions of the Arctic. One is the Arctic climate. And the Arctic climate is where there is not a higher than average temperature of 10 degrees Celsius in July. So the highest average temperature in July is 10 degrees Celsius. Sounds warm on a day like today, but it's not so warm really. The second definition is that it's north of the polar circle, where it is the land of the midnight sun. And the third definition is that it's land that doesn't have trees in the lowland. So it's all tundra, a landscape without trees. So living here in Sweden, you might know that you live in an Arctic state. But of course, in Stockholm, this is not the Arctic. In international relations terms, you live in an Arctic place politically, but in local terms, you live below the Arctic. So here's our second map. So there are 8 countries in the Arctic region. These countries are Sweden, Finland, Norway, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Iceland. Denmark, you may wonder, how does Denmark have land in the Arctic? It's further south than Stockholm. And their Arctic territory is via Greenland. So all of these states have land and territory in the Arctic, defined as Arctic. But this label of Arctic state is both a political and a geographic signifier. So all of these states are members of the Arctic Council, which is a high-level intergovernmental forum which aims to promote cooperation and interaction amongst these states on important Arctic issues, such as sustainable development and environmental protection. But of these 8 states, only 5 of them have territory on the Arctic Ocean. And this is really important. This significance of having an ocean boundary rather than just a land boundary in the Arctic has to do with the different rules that exist in international relations regarding sovereignty over land and sovereignty over sea. But I'll talk about that a little bit more later. You may not be surprised to learn, since I'm talking about the news and the Arctic today, that my interest in the Arctic was first sparked by a newspaper article on the Arctic. This was a 2007 article, which is titled, "Russia Plants a Flag on the North Pole Seabed." And this is an image of this flag, this titanium flag being put on the seabed of the North Pole. And the article talks about how a mini-submersible submarine went down to the seabed at the North Pole with a Soviet hero, a Soviet polar hero called Arthur Chilingorov, and they put this flag, this Russian flag, on the floor. Well, this moment is quite interesting. Oh, the Russians have gone to the North Pole and put down a flag. And you wonder, why did they do that? What are they trying to tell us? It's a second part of the article that really catches my eye. And this is a line right near the bottom which says, "This isn't the 15th century. You can't go around the world and just plant flags and say, we're claiming this territory." And that was said by the Canadian Foreign Minister, Peter MacKay. So now I'm really interested. The Russians do something, the Canadians say, ooh, you can't do that. So the article says that Russia had symbolically staked its claim to millions of dollars of oil and gas reserves in the Arctic. Billions of dollars, not only millions, billions of dollars. So now maybe we know why the Russians might have been doing this, for economic and national security interests. But then the Canadians were saying, look, you can't do that. It's not a legitimate thing anymore. Flag planting might have been okay for Christopher Columbus, but it's not okay for Vladimir Putin. So looking at an article like this one, which says major powers are speeding up the race to the Arctic, we must ask, what is the finish line for this race? We all know that a race has an end target that all the contenders are aiming for. So if there is a race in the Arctic, what is the race about? And why is it so important to be first in this race? One key element about the reporting on the Arctic is sovereignty. Sovereignty in the Arctic is an important issue because, as you know, sovereignty, in a very simple explanation, is about authority over decision-making in a specific territory. And if there are a lot of resources in an area, there's a very good reason to be the one making the decisions on these resources. So when the Canadians tell the Russians they can't claim territory with flags, implying that if they had managed to send that submarine down in the 15th century, it would have been okay, we start to understand that the rules around territory have changed. But they've changed rather slowly and mostly over the last century. So if the rules have changed, and that was the rule in the 15th century, what are the rules now? You may remember that I said only a moment ago that states have land and territory in the Arctic. And this is important because land is always some type of territory, but not all territory is land. While the Canadians indicated that Russia could have planted a flag with a time machine, and it would have worked as a method of gaining new territory, that's not completely true. Because if the Russians would have put a flag on the seabed at the North Pole in the 15th century, they would have found that the rule in the 15th century was that you couldn't have territory in the ocean. And if you look up the word territory in the dictionary, you will find two good definitions. The first definition is that territory is the land under the jurisdiction of a state. And the second definition is that it's an administrative area that doesn't have equal status as other units in a territory or in a country. A good example of this is in Canada, where it's divided up into provinces, and you will find a territory called the Northwest Territories, which doesn't have the same status as a province, such as Ontario or Quebec. So if we're thinking about how territory works in international affairs, the political geographer John Agnew showed us that these two basic definitions are not good enough for understanding how territory works. He talked about the belief in these rigid boundaries as being a territorial trap. If we think about this, we get stuck in a territorial trap, and our thinking about political territory and political authority is flawed if we think about the state as a territorial container. So if both of these definitions aren't good enough, then what are our options for thinking about territory? Well, we're in luck because the political theorist Stuart Eldon has given us a tool for thinking about territory beyond the territorial trap. He suggests that we need to think of territory as a political technology. Now, what is a political technology? I have a definition. It is the exercise of power and the body of practices, strategies, and tactics that state actors use to maintain that power. Territory is not just about land. It is about the control of space. So thinking more broadly about territory is especially important in the international relations of the Arctic for a very specific reason. And that reason is that there are different rules about control over the different types of territory that we find in the Arctic. One set of rules is for land and the land boundaries of countries, and the other set of rules is for ocean territory. And while the rules around territory and sovereignty over land are relatively stable, the rules for sovereignty over ocean spaces have changed very, very quickly in the last few decades. This rapid change sometimes causes confusion because states continue to communicate their intentions about territory. Remembering that territory is a political technology, they communicate their intentions using old methods and old rules that no longer work. And this is where these news stories get their idea about a race for the Arctic. So the end of the 15th century that Peter MacKay was talking about, the era of rapid colonization around the globe, this was a time when flag planting was a starting point for the process for powerful nations to add new territory to their political maps. However, flag planting was only one step of the process. There were actually 4 parts of this process. You had to be first to discover the territory, and then you would do something like flag planting, which was called a ceremony of possession. But flag planting wasn't the only method. There was also things such as erecting crosses or burying coins, but some way of leaving a symbol that you were the person who was there first. 3, you had to communicate this new possession to other people, And one way of communicating this new possession was to write it into your maps, to start producing political maps that had this place on it with names that you had given this land. And finally, you had to possess, occupy, and have effective government administration over this territory. But this process applied only to land and not to the ocean. And of course, then it was very important to be the first one to get there. So here's a diagram of the rules on ocean territory today. And I understand that this diagram is a little bit complicated and a little bit technical, but it shows the different extents and the different legal categories of territory in international law for ocean spaces. So going back to that no territory in the ocean rule that I mentioned, up until the 20th century, the only sovereign territory that a country could have in the oceans was a really narrow strip of coastal waters of about, it was 3 nautical miles, which is equivalent to about 5 kilometers. And that came from something called the cannon shot rule, which was what you could reasonably expect to defend from land with a cannon. So this restriction on the cannon shot rule changed just after World War II, when new categories of territory were added to international law. So regarding the current politics of the Arctic, there are 2 categories of territory that are important to know about. These are the exclusive economic zone, where states have exclusive rights to the resources in the water column, and this includes things like fish stocks. And the second category is the continental shelf, where states have exclusive rights to exploit the resources of the submarine soil, which mostly includes minerals, which might be gold or other valuable elements, but also hydrocarbons. Now, you may notice that I referred to exclusive rights for these areas rather than sovereignty. And this is a very tricky difference, because a key aspect of sovereignty is exclusive rights for resource exploitation and decision-making over a territory. But these exclusive rights that I've just talked about for the exclusive economic zone and for the continental shelf are not absolute sovereignty rights. They are relative sovereignty rights and only relate to exploitation of the resources. So, as I said a little bit earlier, most of the new categories of legal territory appeared just after the World Wars, mostly in the 1980s, and they expanded further into the ocean. So you can see here there's a spot marked in red, a potentially claimable land. And this is a big part of what changed in the 1980s from the World War II the rules from after World War II to the rules in the 1980s. At first, the legal limits for the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf were 200 nautical miles from the land. But in the 1980s, the rule changed and you could claim up to 350 nautical miles from the shore. And this is all part of a body of law called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is largely considered to be the constitution for the world's oceans. But there's a bit of a catch to this change. You couldn't just decide that you were changing your territorial boundaries, your maritime boundaries. To make this change, to potentially claim this area, you had to submit a report to a body called the Commission on the Continental Shelf. And this had to be a very comprehensive scientific report detailing how your report and how your claim met certain scientific guidelines that were included in this law. So this body, when a state submits its claims, will review the report and decide whether or not it meets scientific guidelines. And if it does, they might approve your claim, or they might not. If they don't approve your claim, they might ask you to go back out and get some more evidence, more scientific evidence, in order to substantiate your claim. So in this regard, it isn't so important to be the first to get there, because the limits to this new territory are restricted by existing limits to political boundaries, and also very specific, exact scientific parameters that states have to meet in order to make this extension to their territory. So if you consider the different types of boundaries that you can see on this map, you can see the land boundaries. You have Greenland labeled, and you can see Russia, Sweden, Norway down here on the bottom of the slide. But then you see these colored areas that extend out into the ocean. The areas that have strong colors are within that 200 nautical miles. These are the areas that states can claim quite easily. But the parts that they have to prove scientific measurements for are all of these parts in stripes. And this is where potential claims overlap. So this possible extension to claims is a little bit tricky in the Arctic because of this overlap. The Arctic is the world's smallest ocean, and so this extension made it so states might be trying to claim the same parts of territory. There's also an extra point, another rule in this Constitution for the Oceans, which gives a sense of urgency, a real need to get this done, and to submit these claims to the Commission evaluating the reports. And this rule says that the claims for this extra territory must be submitted within 10 years from the date that the state ratified the convention. So there's a 10-year deadline. So let me give you a list of dates when these 5 Arctic coastal states signed this treaty, and let's see if they have any significance for you. So in reverse order, Denmark, 2004, Canada, 2003, Russia, 1997, Norway, 1996, the United States has not ratified the treaty. So if we calculate 10 years into the future from these dates, what do we get? Norway had a deadline in 2006. Russia had a deadline in 2007. Canada's deadline was 2013. Denmark, 2014. And the United States has no deadline. So given these deadlines, we understand there is a race. There is a race in the Arctic, but it's not a race of state against state. It's a race against the clock. It's a race against time. You could say that this is a hurried rush to state claims to sovereignty, but I think it's better explained as a rush to present the potential loss of exclusive exploitation rights to new parts of the continental shelf. Now, even if the Commission approves these extensions to this territory, there's another problem. So even if this territory is designated theirs to exploit, the second problem is if they can manage to exploit the resources found in these extreme parts of the deepest parts of the Arctic Ocean. There may be many, many, many resources in the Arctic, but many of them right now are not technically recoverable in these extra extended spaces. Most of the resources that are technically recoverable exist in the areas that are already clearly part of the territory of these states. So getting that right to exclusive exploitation in these extended areas doesn't do anyone much of any good. I want to go back to this newspaper article for the end, and back to the image of the man walking away from the flag. So on one side, we can see the Svenska Dagbladet article, an image with a flag signifying sovereignty claims to the Arctic, and a headline talking about Arctic states speeding up and intensifying the race to the Arctic. On the other side, we can see this image used again by another publication. This time, this article was published by the photographer who took the photos, Felipe Dana. And from the headline, up here, we can see that the photograph is a record of a scientific event. It is a photo of a scientist installing a flag to help locate and to identify the location of a GPS device on a glacier in Greenland. The GPS device will be used to monitor the glacier's rate of flow. So from comparing these two headlines, I'd like to ask you, why is this image being used in such different ways? If the role of media is to inform, to persuade, or to entertain, what conclusions can you draw from these two articles about what message they're trying to send? And what is the purpose of sending that message? Now, if I'm honest, I don't have the answer for you. I don't know why we have this article on the left-hand side. But when it comes to the Arctic, we can understand that the politics of the Arctic are not only inside the bordered container of the 8 Arctic states over internal territory, but they're also about spatial control over land and sea, and that this territory is a political technology showing the spatial domain where state authority is being carried out. Across the entire Arctic, the idea of territory is a flexible concept and has different intensities for the use of the word sovereignty. So when the media is talking about a race for sovereignty in the Arctic, they may not know it, but they are not talking about absolute sovereignty or absolute territorial control over the region. The political borders of the Arctic have different areas of control across different types of territory, and these are defined by international law. The main advantage of this relative control over the extended territories of the Arctic Ocean is, of course, the potential access to resources found in this space. In their submarine dive to the North Pole, Russia may have been demonstrating that it had the technical capacity and the technological expertise needed to be able to prove their claims to the Commission on the Continental Shelf for that extended part of territory, which includes the North Pole. However, the technological capability to exploit the resources there is another matter entirely. Without this capability, the sovereignty over this extra part of the Arctic really has no value, no matter how fast you are to prove it or claim it. Thank you.